Hey guys, in this lecture, we are going to be talking about more of New England society, trying to kind of round it out. And we're going to be starting off with some more of those dissenters, people who disagreed with the Puritan rule there in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Because remember, Massachusetts Bay Colony was the really big colony right here on the map in New England. And this is New England, by the way, these northern colonies. So you have Plymouth with the Pilgrims, Massachusetts Bay Colony with the Puritans. Rhode Island, we're going to talk about first with Roger Williams here. Connecticut with New Haven and Hartford, we'll talk about. And then you will also have eventually New Hampshire, which was originally part of Massachusetts Bay Colony. And actually, its charter extended way up here, and also its original charter extended east to west, all the way to the Pacific Ocean originally. But starting off Rhode Island, or Rogue Island, as it was originally called, Roger Williams, its founder, was a very passionate, very liberal, radical minister that came over from London right near the beginning of the Massachusetts Bay Colony to preach. So 1631, he immigrated over. People were very excited to hear him. He was very young and well spoken, and he had some really radical ideas, among which he believed that people should pay the Native Americans for their land, which was very different. He thought it was wrong to just take their land or assume that it was okay for Englishmen to farm on native land without their permission. So he believed in paying them. He also was vehemently against church and state being together. He believes very strongly in a separation of church and state. But I want you to think about that phrase for just a moment. In today's society, separation of church and state often implies that, like things like school prayer, we want religion out of our government. We want religion to have no place in public services like education because we don't want to impose any one religion on people who might not believe that way. That goes to our First Amendment in our Constitution that grants a freedom of religion. And so we are very familiar with that phrase today. But when we say Roger Williams was very much in favor of a separation of church and state, he was coming at it from the opposite angle, meaning that he wanted government to stay out of his church. Because remember, in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, the way it was chartered by the company, the Puritans who founded it, like John Winthrop, was that townspeople would pay their taxes, and those taxes would pay for the church and would pay for the minister. So government was directly into church life and vice versa. So that was another component that where Roger Williams was extremely radical. The last thing, kind of interesting, is with communion. That's drinking the blood and eating the body of Christ in church. Roger Williams, in his ministering, believed that that was only for people who had not sinned. You see where this is going? Like everybody sinned, we know that. But for Roger Williams, the members of his congregation that were able to have communion kept dwindling and dwindling, and pretty soon it was just Roger Williams and his wife Mary were the only ones receiving communion. And then pretty soon, even Mary was not receiving communion. It was just him. And then he realized, oh no, I'm a sinner too. And so he comes across this very radical notion that we are all sinners and we get communion to help us not to sin. He also rejects the conviction that Puritans were this elect group of people on a divine mission, city on a hill, like Winthrop said, to spread the true faith. Williams denied that God had singled out any one group for special favorites. And so he is not popular among the leadership of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And that's why he's going to be banished. He's exiled in 1636, and he's going to go down south and establish the colony of Rhode Island. Rogue Island, as it is sometimes called, became a beacon for religious freedom. It's not going to have an established church, no religious qualifications for voting until the 1700s. And so remember, in Massachusetts Bay Colony, In order to vote, you had to be male, you had to be a full church member, one of the visible saints, and you had to be land owning. That is not going to be the case in Rhode Island. No religious qualifications for voting, and no requirement for citizens to attend church. Remember, in Puritan Massachusetts Bay Colony, not attending church was actually a serious crime. You could be killed for not attending church. And so, because of these reasons, Rhode Island becomes a haven for dissenters, not just other Protestants who don't fit in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, but disparate groups, including like Jews, will actually flock to Rhode Island to escape persecution. And its frame of government met a lot more often and was much more democratic than a lot of these other colonies that we've been talking about. So that is Rhode Island. Please remember, it's going to be a lot more tolerance, a lot more religious toleration, a lot more freedom than a lot of other places. That's Roger Williams' influence there. Another colony to know about is going to be Connecticut. So with Connecticut, in 1636, same year that Roger Williams was exiled from Massachusetts Bay Colony, there's going to be this minister named Thomas Hooker who's going to establish a settlement in Hartford. Its system of government embodied in what's called the Fundamental Orders of 1639. So that's the government of this Connecticut colony. It was modeled on that of Massachusetts, but with one significant exception, and that being that men did not have to be church members to vote. It's just like Rhode Island. That's a big deal and very attractive for democracy. Quite different from New Haven, there's going to be another colony formed in 1638 by immigrants who actually wanted an even closer connection between church and state, so the opposite of Williams, and that's New Haven. Finally, in 1662, Hartford, under Thomas Hooker, and New Haven, this other place, they're going to receive a royal charter that unites them, and that's how you get the colony of Connecticut. So far, keep track with me, guys. See this map? So far, we talked about Plymouth Colony, that's the Pilgrims, the Puritan separatists. We have Massachusetts Bay Colony, those are the Puritans. That's the big one. Lots and lots of people, 21,000, the Great Migration. Now we have talked about Rhode Island with Roger Williams, religious toleration there. And we talked about the Connecticut colony, New Haven and Hartford combined by the late 1600s. That's the Connecticut colony. So these are kind of the dissenters, the separatists, the Puritans. Oh, and also just kind of interesting, the Massachusetts Bay Colony's original charter went pretty far up north into Maine. And originally it went east to west all the way. I can't quite move my mouse, all the way to the Pacific Ocean. That was its original charter. As far as the interaction between the Native Americans and these New Englanders, couple things to note is that the Pequots were one of the biggest tribes, especially early on, that these settlers had to deal with. They're also having to deal with the Iroquois. And this Pequot War, it's going to begin in 1637 when a fur trader was killed by Pequots. A force of Connecticut and Massachusetts soldiers that were supported by their Native American Narragansett allies. That was a common feature in these earlier colonial wars. Often Native Americans would be on both sides of the conflict. They're going to surround the main Pequot fortified village at Mystic, which was also along a river, the Mystic River. And they're going to set the whole village on fire, trapping and burning to death those that were inside who could not escape. In total, over 500 men, women, and children are going to lose their lives in the Mystic Massacre. And by the end of the Pequot War, a few months later, so this is 1637, most of the Pequot had been either exterminated or those that had survived had been sold into slavery in the West Indies. That's the Caribbean. Pretty harsh, okay? And so one of the common threads you can see is that even though there are some exceptions like the Pilgrims and the early contact they had with the Wampanoag, overall the trend seems to be like with Jamestown and here with the Massachusetts Bay Colony that Native Americans are tentatively trying to see what's happening at first, and when they see that the English settlers are taking more and more land, conflict develops, war happens, and the natives are pushed further and further west off of their land, or they are annihilated completely. And so that's what's going on with the Pequot War. So the Pequot are wiped out. Kidnapping was actually a common feature during this time when Native Americans and the English fought. Native Americans would not kill all their defeated enemy, unlike the English. They would take children and women sometimes hostage and raise them among their tribe, teaching them their culture. Now, some of these English would escape, or they would be granted their freedom by their Native American tribe. And a lot of them actually told how they were treated very well. They were accepted as one of the family, one of the tribe, basically, in what's called the captivity narratives. Now, this was kind of damaging for the Massachusetts Bay Colony leadership because remember that Puritan lifestyle is incredibly strict. Like during the English Civil War, Christmas was not even allowed. There was no theater. You weren't allowed to go to shows. Not allowed to wear bright colors. Um, it's pretty strict and dour, and there's not really a lot of toleration for differences at all. This is a very stark society where you either conform or you are banished. And so when these survivors tell what it was like living among the Native Americans, that was actually really attractive for a lot of these Puritan settlers. A lot of them wanted to go and live amongst the Native Americans. And so they started politicizing some kind of made up captivity journals that emphasized how the Native Americans were evil or how they were constantly during their captivity trying to get back for their Christian purposes. There's also one more thing. This phenomenon known as praying villages or praying towns. That was where Native Americans who wanted to do trade with the Europeans would be encouraged to live. These towns were established on the outskirts of the colonies, on like the Indian frontier. And in a praying village, these natives were called that because they were kind of encouraged slash forced, if they wanted to trade, to convert to Christianity and adapt the habits of the white man. And this made them a target for other Native Americans. So they were often some of the first that were massacred in many of these skirmishes and attacks. So the English Civil War is going to occur in the 1640s. It's a conflict that arises back home in England between those that are following the king, which we will call the Cavaliers, and those that are following Parliament, which were called the Roundheads. And those that are following Parliament, that's the semi-elected at this time governments of England. Those were mainly Puritans, like those that had come over in the Great Migration to the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So the effects back home of this English Civil War back in the United States are going to be pretty profound. The leaders of the House of Commons, that's the elected body that, along with the hereditary aristocrats of the House of Lords, makes up the English Parliament. They're going to start this war by accusing the Stuart kings. At this point, when it starts, that's going to be King Charles I, of endangering liberty by imposing taxes without parliamentary consent. That should sound familiar. Think about later on, like during the American Revolution, right? Imprisoning political foes and leading the nation back towards Catholicism. As remember, England had survived all of those religious conflicts when King Henry VIII and his daughter Mary and then his daughter Elizabeth brought England back and forth with the Church of England and then Catholicism and then back towards it. So they don't want to go back to Catholicism and reignite those holy wars. Civil War broke out in 1642, resulting in a victory for the forces of Parliament. In 1649, Charles I, the King of England, is actually publicly beheaded. The monarchy abolished, and England declared a commonwealth and free state. That's a nation governed by the will of the people. Oliver Cromwell, he's going to become the leader of this victorious parliamentary force. He's going to rule for almost a decade after the execution of Charles I, kind of as a dictator. And then he tries to pass it on to his son, which a lot of people are saying, isn't that what we just left? And so in 1660, you have what's called the restoration of the monarchy, where the monarchy is restored when Charles II assumes the throne. That's Charles I's son, who was in exile in France. But by then, the breakdown of authority of the king had kind of stimulated intense discussions of freedom and authority and what it means to be a freeborn Englishman and what rights an English person should have. So this is a pretty big deal, and you're going to have new ideas about freedom, like the writer John Milton. He called for freedom of speech and the press. These are ideas integral to the United States. They're written into our Constitution, into our Bill of Rights. New religious sects are going to spring up because of the English Civil War, demanding religious toleration for all Protestants, as well as the end of public financing and special privileges for the Church of England, the Anglican Church. The Levelers, history's first democratic political movement, proposed an actual written constitution, the agreement of the people, which began by proclaiming at how high a rate we value our just freedom. Although democracy was still widely equated with anarchy, that's where you have no government at all, the document the Levelers proposed was going to try to abolish the monarchy in the House of Lords and greatly expand the right to vote for many more English people. Now, back home in the colonies, the Civil War, accompanied by vigorous discussions of the rights of freeborn Englishmen, inevitably reverberated throughout the South and in the Chesapeake, the Middle Colonies, and into New England, dividing them from one another and dividing the colonies internally amongst themselves. Most New Englanders sided with Parliament in the Civil War in the 1640s because they're Puritan, that's the Roundheads. Some returned to England to join the parliamentary army or to take up pulpits to help create a godly commonwealth at home. But Puritan leaders were increasingly uncomfortable as the idea of religious toleration for Protestants gained favor in England. Because remember, Puritans, they want to be able to practice their faith free from outside influence and free from others. It's not religious toleration in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Meanwhile, a number of followers of Anne Hutchinson became what's called Quakers, one of the sects that sprang up in England during the English Civil War. Quakers held that the Spirit of God dwelled within every individual, not just the elect, and that this inner light, rather than the Bible or teachings of the clergy, offered the surest guidance in spiritual matters. When Quakers appeared in Massachusetts, colonial officials actually had them whipped, fined, and exiled. In 1659 and 1660, 4 Quakers who returned from exile were actually hanged to death. When Charles II, after the restoration of the monarchy, reaffirmed the Massachusetts Charter, the Royal Charter, he ordered the colony to recognize the liberty of conscience of all Protestants. As far as the English Civil War goes, in Maryland, the combination of the religious and political battles of the Civil War, homegrown conflict between Catholic and Protestant settlers, and anti-proprietary feeling produced a violent civil war within the colony called the Plundering Time. All Christians were eventually guaranteed the free exercise of religion with the Act Concerning Religion in 1649, although the act did not grant this right to non-Christians. It did, over time, bring some political stability to Maryland. All right, guys, we're going to stop there because I think I'm running a little bit long, but we will wrap up New England next time, and I really appreciate y'all's attention. Remember, big things here is that you had dissenters forming a lot of these other New England colonies. Relationship with Native Americans is going to be fraught, as it will be elsewhere. And the English Civil War is going to be dividing colonies from each other and dividing colonies from within due to these religious differences and differences of opinion about English freedom and rights between the monarchy and the elected government known as Parliament. Thank you guys for listening. I'll talk to you later. Bye.